Okay, we're starting now. Okay, here we go, for whoever's here. Many years ago, I visited a friend of mine, an Episcopal priest, and his family and his 3 children, and I came on a Friday night, and we played in the playground adjacent to the rectory there and to the church. And then we went to bed that night, and I came down the next morning, and I saw my friend's son, Luke, and he looks at me and he says, "Hey, I remember you." And I said, "I remember you too." And it was a good thing we remembered one another. Now, I start with that little story because you're going to see here in a moment why. By the way, before we get into that, I want to mention to you that Luann Huska was supposed to have done this teaching with me this morning. I was hoping to integrate some of her material into my stuff, but I would have just mashed it in. It wouldn't have been right. It wouldn't have been honoring to what she has, and I hope she can give it to us at some point. It's wonderful stuff. She is right now with her family, with her mom in Texas. Her whole family, they drove down there before their mom goes to China to stop chemotherapy and try traditional Chinese medicine. So let's keep Luann in our prayers, okay? And she texted me and she said, "Holding you in the congregation in prayer today, Ron." So, hey, I remember you. When Jesus gives communion to the disciples, he says, "Do this in remembrance of me." I have wondered about Jesus' very specific and request to this very select group. And these are the only ones who can truly remember him because they were with him. And remembrance in Judaism is among the highest virtues. The Passover meal was the quintessential meal of remembrance in which the family head recounts the story, "A wandering Aramean was my father." And the purpose of remembrance was not simply to recall the past, but to represent the past in order to participate in it and to extend its effects into the present. And so Passover made contemporary the Exodus for the Jews, and the disciples of Jesus now are encouraged not to remember the Exodus, although of course they do, but they are to bring that and see Jesus himself as the Exodus. And the meal recalls Jesus, and that is recalled now so powerfully is illustrated in the story that Jim mentioned in his sermon, the Emmaus, right? He made mention to it. Jesus was made known to Cleopas and his companion in the breaking of the bread. So, as we think about this, Jesus saying, "Do this in remembrance of me," my wonder increases when I read the story the second time of Jesus. This is the second time Jesus gives communion to his disciples after his resurrection when he breaks bread at an inn with 2 of his disciples. And as they walk, remembering and recalling and recounting what has happened to Jesus, a stranger joins them. And he says to them, "What happened to this guy you're talking about? Do tell me, please." And they start all over and they fill him in with their most recent memories of the one who now only exists in their memory, or so they think. And then they invite the stranger to stay with them and have dinner with us. They say, "Spend the night with us." They extend hospitality to him. And he's a stranger as far as they know. And at the table, he takes the bread and he breaks it, and immediately this fellow is a stranger no longer, and their eyes fly open and they say, "Hey, we remember you." Do this in remembrance. The disciples are doing this, but not in remembrance of Jesus, but because in the breaking of the bread, they have him as a real and living presence in their lives. Memories cannot keep someone alive. And Jesus says, "You don't have to remember me, you have me." And as soon as Jesus breaks the bread, he no longer is their guest. He has now become their host, and in 2 ways. He hosts the meal, and he is the meal. The bread is the host. And the disciples now have Jesus by the power of the Holy Spirit that is now burning in their hearts with this unquenchable fire. And this is the fire of life It's the fire of life after death. It's the fire of the resurrected Jesus. St. Ephrem the Syrian says, it is the descent of the Spirit as fire that affects the consecration of the bread and wine. And when people die, all the energy, the warmth that energy creates dissipates. It's dispersed into the environment as heat energy. The heat transfers from the body into the world. Dead bodies grow cold. As we age, we produce less heat. Old people are always cold. I am old and cold. I have a hand. Well, cold, I mean, I hope I'm not emotionally, but just, I can be that way too, but Tammy is helping me out with that. But, so, not so with children. They are flushed, rosy cheeked. Their bodies are little radiators, right? They're closer to life than they are to death. And when the two disciples experience here, they're like kids saying, oh, we remember you. And their hearts are burning within them. And this is a reversal of entropy. Their inner beings are being energized by the risen Jesus. And so we come now, on your outline there if you're following it, or we just did Jesus, the host in the fire, from the cross to the table, binding and healing. As I mentioned, for Jews, the constitutive inbreaking of God into human history was the Exodus from Egypt. For Christians, it is the crucifixion of Jesus, which is the good news, but not immediately apparent to the disciples. And both of these historical events are commemorated in liturgical ceremonies. The Exodus and Passover, and Jesus' crucifixion in our Eucharist. At the Exodus, the Egyptian firstborn sons die. At the cross, God's only begotten Son dies. And so, it's no wonder the disciples, after seeing their rabbi, their Savior, their Lord, die on the cross, it's a cataclysmic event that just scatters them. It disorients them. In some ways, it disintegrates them. And how does Jesus reorient them? How does he reintegrate them to himself? Well, you know what he does, right? He starts eating. He gathers them. He regroups the disciples around the breakfast and dinner tables, around the Paschal feast. And it's the fire of that hearth that also bakes the bread. And Jesus is the bread. And we partake together along with the disciples and all through history who have partaken of the risen Lord. His sacrificial death is now transmuted into resurrection life. And now it becomes our life, and it becomes our life together. Ignatius of Antioch, either the second or third bishop of Antioch, who was martyred in AD 110, believed that the Eucharist is the primary symbol of the church's unity and the primary means of making that unity real for believers. The unity of the body and blood of Christ is a source of unity of the church as the body of Christ. Have you ever been tempted to say, I'm tired of church, I'm not going today? In fact, I don't know when I'll go again. Have you ever been at that point? I have. But then this, to come together in unity, to bring our fractured selves, our fractured bodies, our fractured community together around the table. And I also want to add there's a therapeutic aspect of eating the bread and drinking the cup together. St. Ephrem the Syrian, I just mentioned, he wrote in Syriac and he penned a lot of poetry. He tells us that Christ's hidden presence in the Eucharistic bread and cup is the medicine of life. And one ancient Mesopotamian symbol that Ephrem used a great deal is this medicine of life, by which he brings together the incarnation and the Eucharist. And Ephrem says the bread and the wine take up residence as a hidden and healing power in the communicant. Another guy, Addison Hodges Hart. But the essential fact of the matter is that the gospel of Christ has always been profoundly therapeutic. Every miracle of healing, including the exorcism that Jesus performs in the Gospels, points beyond the physical plane to a deeper healing of the whole person. This is why you guys know that I'm working as a chaplain at CDH, and the doctors recognize how valuable chaplains are to help bring the healing power of Jesus into people's lives. And that helps them heal physically. And they see that connection, they see that correlation there. I got to tell you this too. There's a great book. It's called Dementia: Living in the Memories of God by John Swinton. And he writes this. He says that for the ancient Hebrews, remembering is always connected to action. We're getting to the post-communion prayer here. Remembering an image is not to only reflect on it, but to act, to assist in determining right action. And then Swinton says this. The crucial parallel is this. When God remembers, God acts. More specifically, God's memory is for the purpose of remembering. To remember something is to bring back together that which has been fragmented in terms of the redemption of humanity. To be remembered by God is to be reconstituted and brought back together, moved from a state of fragmentation to one of wholeness in God. And that is shalom, peace. We're getting here to the rhythm of the Eucharist. Matt Milliner said many moons ago, the waters of baptism that we walk under to come into the nave, look at that mural, are the same waters of baptism that send us out into the world. And note that in our tradition, we cannot participate in the Eucharist. We cannot eat and drink with the family until we have been baptized into the family. And the rhythm of the Eucharist, there's a fundamental rhythm here, isn't there, of coming in and going out. My son is a jazz guitarist, and he tells me, Dad, without rhythm, I have no rhythm. Terrible. You ever seen me dance? Don't. He said, Dad, without rhythm, you don't have music. I try to have rhythm. When the music comes, I start to flow. I kind of lurch around, but there's rhythm there. Rhythm helps bind together individual and isolated and disparate notes of music into a score and then into a song. And harmony does this too. This is why we love harmony so much. And then what does rhythm do? It moves the music along. There is purposeful movement. Without rhythm, the music would not move. Anglicanism is full of rhythms by which we bring together, we integrate the stuff of life. And some of that seems to be opposed, right, to each other, some of those things. Opposites. And we draw them together in a paradox so that we are moved, so that we are stirred to bring forth the fruit of good works. I believe that was last Sunday's collect. So think of some of the rhythms of Anglicanism, the opposites. We have feast and fast. We have said and sung. We have ordinary and extraordinary. We have Lent and Carnival. Anything else you can think of? I'm getting to that. Very good. Rich is anticipating my next thought. So all of this is embodied in the rhythm of liturgy. It is moving. It moves us, of course. It warms and stirs our hearts. And then it moves us, or we move with it, into the nave, as we come in, up to the table, and then back out into the world, which is our Father's world. This is our Father's table, our Father's world. And the fundamental rhythm of human life is death. Well, let me explain. Dying is as much a part of life as being born. It is also the ultimate paradox, the binding together of opposites, death and life, that moves us forward. We are moving towards death, and it is this movement towards death that gives our lives purpose. How many of you have a bucket list? Maybe not yet. I'm starting to form mine, right? Before I die, this is what I want to do. But not just the things we do before we die, but the things we want to accomplish that give our lives purpose and meaning. And death does this. Same for God. He had to die to accomplish his purpose for the world. And by his death, thank God, he brings life. And when Jesus breaks bread with the disciples on the road to Emmaus, he is giving them his life from his death. And so, this is the essence of sacrifice. Sacrifice is pointless if it is also meaningless. The point of sacrifice is to give up something that is dear to you to gain something even greater. And the ultimate sacrifice is Jesus' death, and the ultimate reward is the life that comes from that death. And when Jesus has given to us, we partake of at the Eucharist, not so that we never have to sacrifice, but so that we too can sacrifice our lives to bring life as Jesus did, as he did in us. The Eucharist is life-giving. It is also life-offering. It's a pouring out of our lives. This is the movement of the Eucharist. It's a rhythm from death to life. We are sent out not to save our lives, but to give our lives. And not to just give of our time, our talent, our resources. We hear that all the time. What does it mean to give our very lives? I want you to think about that a little bit. Think about that with me. The church, this is Ignatius again, the church is called the place of sacrifice because the Eucharist itself is a sacrifice. The altar is thus an essential component of the celebration. Father James talked about the Eucharistic life last Sunday, and really this is just a continuation of what he presented last Sunday. And I'm going to look again at Alexander Schmemann, his book there. You can read with me this great quote from your handout. And thus the offering to God of bread and wine is our offering to him of ourselves, of our life, and of the whole world. It is our Eucharist. It is a movement that Adam failed to perform and that in Christ has become the very life of man. A movement of adoration and praise in which all joy and suffering, all beauty and all frustration, all hunger and all satisfaction are referred to their ultimate end and become finally meaningful. Yes, to be sure, it is sacrifice, but sacrifice is the most natural act of man, the very essence of his life. Man is a sacrificial being because he finds his life in love, and love is sacrificial. It puts the value, the very meaning of life in the other and gives life to the other. And in this giving, in the sacrifice, finds the meaning and joy of life. I have the Book of Common Prayer, the 1559, the Elizabethan prayer book. I've memorized morning prayer in that, so when I do morning prayer here, I get a little confused. I don't know which one to use, but I do use our Anglican, the 2019. But I read this in that book. This is from Cranmer. We eat the bread and drink the wine, the body and blood of Christ, whereby that mutual indwelling occurs, a participation in his sacrificial life and death, for which the only appropriate response is self-offering with thanksgiving. Christ's sacrifice inspires our sacrificial service. And then Cranmer and others, as they put together the prayer book, the prayer of consecration proceeds with the communion, an integral part. The prayer flowing without interruption to the prayer of oblation or post-communion thanksgiving. The whole was a holy communion. The whole is a holy communion. The entire worship service. Matt, I'm going to quote you again. Hope it's all right. And the church is not the community of people filled with themselves, but we are instead the epitome of that emptiness, so that God can fill us to overflowing into the need of the world around us, where he is present as well, When we recognize his presence here, when our hearts are warm, guess what? We will recognize God out there, and we will know it's him. The artist and writer and artist Makoto Fujimura. Anyone know him? Excellent, yes. Tells about meeting a friend for breakfast and the prayer of thanks that she prayed. She said she prayed, Lord, use this food, this breakfast, to prepare us for our deaths. And when Fujimura asked her what she meant by that, she said she had just watched her grandmother die. And she held her grandmother's hands as she was received into Christ's hands. The fire of life and the fire of death are one and the same. It's the fire of sacrifice. And Fujimura says that in the Eucharist, when we approach the table, we are praying, Lord, use this food, this breakfast to prepare us for our deaths. How many of us are thinking of that, right, when we gather around here? It's morbid. Oh, no, it's not. It's life-giving. Because by being prepared for death, in anticipation of death, we live in Christ. And the table is a fiery table of Christ. And his resurrected presence, Fujimura writes, feeds us with his fire so that we will be strengthened to face the fires and floods of our lives. Have you faced any fires or floods? I'm looking at you guys. In your life recently? They too are consecrated by God. And this is the paradox of the table where we are nourished, given life, so that we can give that life by dying with intention and sacrifice of our lives. We're doing very well on time here, by the way. We're going to finish early, so anyway. We got so much time, right? 20 minutes. It's a luxury. So we return to Emmaus. Were all of you here to hear Jim's sermon in the first service? It connects so beautifully to this. The Lord knows what he's doing here, right? I mean, just listen again to a sermon if you heard it the first time, and those of you who haven't heard it, you'll see the connection. Jesus inhabits the disciples on the road to Emmaus. And then when he goes in, when he inhabits the disciples, and when he has breakfast with them, and when he were at the beach, that beautiful scene when he says to Peter, Peter, do you love me? And 3 times when Peter is beside himself, you know I love you, Lord. And I think Jesus is reminding Peter, Peter, I know you love me. You are full of shame, you are full of fear right now, but your love is so strong for me, and I understand that, and I love you, Peter. And then what does he say to Peter? He says, Peter, you are going to go out from here, and someone else will bring you, Peter, to where you do not wish to go. Well, that's startling. I love you, Peter. You're going to end up where you do not wish to go. You're going to die. Love to death. Wow. With Jesus in them, the disciples go and serve in places they did not want or expect to be. And Fujimura again suggests that our Emmaus road leads to songs of descent rather than songs of ascent. Because once we've climbed the mountain, Jesus says, get back down the mountain. Bring healing to that father and the son down there at the bottom of the mountain. The father is crying desperately for his son. And the father and the son were at the top of the mountain. You think of the Lord's Prayer, the scope of the Lord's Prayer, Jesus at the top of the mountain praying and saying, Our Father. And the bottom of the mountain, a father pleading for his son, deliver us from evil. That's the entire Lord's Prayer right there. And maybe Jesus and his disciples were singing songs of descent as they went down the mountain. Obedience to Christ sends us out into our Father's world and can land us in disorienting situations. And when we're in disorienting situations, we need to rely on Jesus' presence within us and Jesus' presence within the community, within the body, within our good friends. And when we go out into the world in that disorienting situation, Jesus is already there. And he's also there to meet us. Not just here, he's out there. The going out, because he's there. And we share the Eucharistic feast. We open our homes and our hearts with the outsiders, the migrants, the poor, the other. We carry the tears of Christ and sing songs of descent as we go. I'm a sucker for melancholy songs. Are you the same? Leonard Cohen, I know, he's a crazy guy. But my gosh, when he sings the bittersweetness of life, and that guy was acquainted with Judaism, with Christianity, I believe he knew God. Because he sings the deep longing right of our hearts. A song of descent. Because we find Jesus there. Jesus weeping. Pouring out compassion. This is the sending out. As we receive the love, we go out with it. Perhaps you've been thinking of your own sacrifice. What does it look like? What's the shape and the form of that sacrifice? How is it challenging you? And I want to read just a bit of a story of sacrifice. It's from Alexei Navalny's prison diaries. You know Alexei Navalny, right? The Russian opposition leader. And he writes a diary of his account of his last years. And this diary is his admonition to his country and the world. And he died not too long ago. And he was in Germany, right? He was poisoned by the Russian government, and he was in Germany. And he could have stayed there and lived lived out the rest of his life. He said, I got to go back to Russia. I've got to go back and tell them in my bodily presence. I read this and I thought, I don't need to read anything else ever again. Well, I better not say that. As a priest, I need to keep reading the Bible, the Book of Common Prayer. But, man, so I pick up the story at the point where Alexei tells us how he is going to endure these extended prison sentences and most likely his death. And the first technique, he says, is to imagine the worst, the very worst, and accept it. And he writes about a visit from his wife, Yulia. I guess I let her come at some point. And he said, on our first extended visit, we walked down a corridor and spoke at a spot as far removed as possible from the cameras wired for sound that are tucked in all over the place. I whispered in her ear, listen, I don't want to sound dramatic, but I think there's a high probability that I'll never get out of here. Even if everything starts falling apart, they will bump me off at the first sign. The regime is collapsing. They will poison me. I know, she said with a nod, in a voice that was calm and firm. I was thinking that myself. At that moment, I wanted to seize her in my arms and hug her joyfully as hard as I could. That was so great. No tears. It was one of those moments when you realize you found the right person. Or perhaps she found you. Let's just decide for ourselves that this is most likely what's going to happen. Let's accept it as a base scenario and arrange our lives on that basis. If things turn out better, that will be marvelous. But we won't count on it or have ill-founded hopes. And she says, yep, let's do it. As usual, her voice sounded as if it belonged to a character in a cartoon, but she was dead serious. She looked up at me and batted her eyes with those big eyelashes, at which point I swept her up in my arms, hugging her in delight. Where else could I ever have found someone who could discuss the most difficult matters with me without a lot of drama and hand-wringing? She entirely got it, and like me, would hope for the best, but expect and prepare for the worst. Yulia laughed and broke free. I kissed her on the nose and felt much better. Oh, isn't that marvelous? Boy. And then he says, the process going on in your head is by no means straightforward, but if you find yourself in a bad situation, you should try this. Think of the worst, accept it. It works as long as you think through everything seriously. And then, the second technique is so old that you may roll your eyes heavenward when you hear it. It is religion. It is doable only for believers, but does not demand zealous, fervent prayer by the prison barracks window 3 times a day, a very common phenomenon in prisons. I have always thought and said openly that being a believer makes it easier to live your life and to an even greater extent engage in opposition politics. Faith makes life simpler. And faith, I would add to that, also sets us free. He says the initial position for this exercise is the same as for the previous one. You lie in your bunk looking up at the one above and ask yourself whether you are a Christian in your heart of hearts. It is not essential for you to believe some old guys in the desert once lived to be 800 years old, or that the sea was literally parted in front of someone. But are you a disciple of the religion whose founder sacrificed himself for others, paying the price for their sins? If you can honestly answer yes, what is there left for you to worry about? Why, under your breath, would you mumble 100 times something you read from a hefty tome you keep in your bedside table? Don't worry about the morrow, because the morrow is perfectly capable of taking care of itself. My job is to seek the kingdom of heaven and his righteousness, and leave it to Jesus and the rest of his family to deal with everything else. They won't let me down and will sort out all my headaches. As they say in prison here, they will take my punches for me. A sacrificial life. A man and a woman, his wife, who know Jesus and lived and died for Jesus. And Yulia is now still bravely and courageously presenting the truth, right? What is truth? Pilate says to Jesus. I am. The cross is truth. Death is truth. Life after death is truth. So, the post-communion prayer, as we come in the rhythm, there's nothing better than being able to distribute the elements as we're gathered around this altar. It moves me. 2 or 3 years ago, I was having a hard time here at church, a lot of things going on. And I came by myself to this altar, and I started walking around it, and suddenly I was just overwhelmed with sorrow and grief, and I just wept. And I needed to weep. I needed to let those tears flow. Because those tears were hard, but they were healing tears. Because there's so much love here, right? So much life, so much bread, good wine. And then we go out in that love and that freedom, right? We're free. We can die. It's all right. It'll be okay. Jesus has taken our punches for us. So that's all I have. Do you guys have any questions, thoughts? Think about how you might live the sacrificial life. What does it mean to you? What does it look like for you? If you have home group, maybe you might want to talk about that together. I don't know. Yeah. It's 10:40. We have a little bit of time. To hear from any of you, Marcus? Yes?
You were reading from Alexi's notes.
I was reading from his prison diaries. Yeah.
Published recently.
Those are published recently. I believe they're available now. Yep. I read it out of an article in I think it was in the New Yorker. It was there. So I read that excerpt. I was just, so moved by that. Yeah. So, and in keeping in the tradition of Russian writers, I mean, we can Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Solzhenitsyn, right? I mean, these people are acquainted with suffering, and they know life, right? Boy, oh boy, yeah. So, in keeping with that tradition, yeah, wonderful. Yes.
I like the title of your talk, Ascending.
Yep.
I like that in the sending prayer, the word send. Send us out to do the
Work you have given us to do, to love and to serve.
It's the movement and the rhythm as well.
Yeah.
But it's like I just find it very helpful. It moves me that after what we have received, we get to go and do that work.
Yeah. Thanks. It's a beautiful thing about Anglicanism, that in the framework of this, right, it's not a tight, constricting framework. We move, and the Spirit moves in us as we participate in this liturgy together. Yeah. So, the movement. Yeah. Marcus.
Yeah, I had a quick question about Schmieman's quote,
Yeah.
specifically the phrase, "It is the movement that Adam failed to perform." I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little more about that. Is he failing to perform it as participant or priest? And in what sense is he failing to perform the Eucharist?
I don't know. What do you guys think? I'm not sure. I mean, he was appointed as a priest, right? He and Eve as a priest and a farmer, right? So we've got these agricultural images as well as these priestly images as well, bread and wine. So he did fail in that, and the movement, he failed in his movement to restore the world, right? All the world along with God, and they were banished from the garden. So that movement out is not a movement, it's a banishment, but it was also banishment of grace to move into the world. So that's something I would say, but I'm not sure, Yeah.
I was thinking too, it feels like it's the movement that Cain failed to perform.
Ah, yes. Could you say that again? It's a movement that,
It's the movement that Cain failed to perform.
and how so? Expand, clarify.
In the sense that he didn't make an appropriate sacrifice, and sort of interpreting the Eucharist then as Cain, in this case, operating as the priest or as the participant. I'm not quite sure how to unpack that phrase.
Yes, Mary, you have something?
Yeah.
Go ahead, stand up.
I think, hello?
I don't know.
I think if you look at the sentence, it says, it is the movement that Adam failed to perform. And then he says, it is the movement of adoration and praise, in which all joy and suffering, all beauty and all frustration, and all satisfaction. So I think he's not talking about a literal sacrifice. I think he's saying that Adam failed to sacrifice himself to God by disobedience I'm just parsing this a little bit. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I think that is really what we're talking about, is sacrificing ourselves.
All right. Thanks, Mary. We have Jennifer back there to weigh in on this.
So, my dad's Aunt Mary, my great Aunt Mary, was a lifelong Methodist, and as you exited her church in Michigan out to the parking lot, there was lettering that had probably been painted on there many years ago, and it said, "You are now entering your mission field." And I appreciated that at the time and have thought a lot about it since. And one thing that I love at All Souls is that we have a mural that tells us that we are now entering our mission field. And I think connecting with what Elizabeth said, we see the city, we see some different towns, we see nature, and we have a calling there. I think part of being sent is walking out the door and trying to figure out what your work is. What's your mission field? What does God have for you this afternoon, this week, in your life?
Thanks. Yeah. Matt.
Yeah, speaking of the mural, we were sitting close to it, and I never noticed there are 4. I know Christ had 5 wounds, but there's 4 visible in the body, and there are 4 wounds on the tree. So there's this beautiful connection between the sacrificial reality of the tree that will ultimately die and give its life for more trees, and Christ, the maker of all reality. It's like, I know what pure and perfect sacrifice is, and there's glimmers of it in nature when an animal gives its life for another for the last billions of years. I mean, but Christ is the perfection of that.
Yeah. It's fundamental to our right to nature, to the world, and he is a perfection of it. Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Matt. Yeah. And Jennifer and Mary and Marcus. Yeah. It's marvelous. It's just marvelous. Well, one more thing from Mary, all right? And then we got to go.
I love what you're, in terms of the whole dance and coming in and coming out, but one of the things, I think I already mentioned this once, but I'll say it again, is that we bring the gospel in, but we leave the gospel there. We don't parade the gospel out. And a writer I read recently said, that's because we are now the gospel going out into the world. That we are the ones who are taking the gospel out into the world. So I love that too.
Yeah.
If you ever wonder, why don't we parade the gospel out? We don't.
It's wonderful. We are the gospel. And now we will all leave. Carry the gospel. It's bind yourselves around it. Bind yourselves together. We have a wonderful congregation here, and because I think we understand that, right? It's the gospel that gives us life and binds us together. So God be with you. Be at peace. I'll bring
Maybe,
it along.
yeah, that'd be helpful. Thanks.
So,